Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Freedom Fighters of Faith with LJM. I am your host this evening. I am Linda Wiggins-Chavis. Normally I have a co-host, but he has not joined me today. So I just want to say hi to Rodney and to Yasin as well. But let me just introduce LJM. LJM is Liberative Justice Ministries, and we are a nonprofit organization that's engaged in ministry that really tries to address the intersectionality between theology and social justice. So what that means is that we are a ministry that actually seeks to dismantle various areas of social justice as they exist in this country. And one of the areas that we are looking at tonight will be healthcare disparities. So that is the topic of our show tonight. It is healthcare disparities in the Black community. And let me introduce my guests, and then I will give you a little bit about their background. So please welcome Dr. Kirk Johnson and Dr. Jennifer Payne Parrish to the show. Yay! So I'm so glad they were both able to join me this evening, because this is going to be a good show. And not just a good show, it's a very serious topic that we really need to discuss more so in the church and in various ministries than we currently do. And that was one of the reasons I really wanted to discuss this topic tonight. So let me go ahead and introduce our guests. Dr. Kirk Johnson, just so everyone knows, he is part of the ministry, Liberative Justice Ministries. But in addition to that, Dr. Kirk has received his Master's of Divinity from Drew Theological School. He and I went to seminary together. And he also received his doctorate in medical humanities from Drew University. He teaches courses in medical humanities, bioethics, global issues, philosophy, and religion. He is a member of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities and the New York Academy of Medicine. He serves as a member of the Atlantic Health Systems Bioethics Committee. He is the former Assistant Director of the Medical Humanities Program at Drew University and Fellow Emeritus of the American Heart Association, the American Heart Association's Multicultural Initiatives Leadership Fellowship Program. He is also a member of the clergy in the United Church of Christ, and he has also written a book, which I have here, called Medical Stigmata. And the subtitle is Race, Medicine, and the Pursuit of Theological Liberation. So welcome, Dr. Kirk. And
thank you for having
me. Thank you. And then we also have Dr. Jennifer Payne Parrish, who holds a BA in Science from Hampton University and a PhD in Pathology from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She has been a leader in the pharmaceutical industry for the past 22 years. Dr. Parrish oversees the scientific and commercial development of central nervous system products in the disease areas of Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy, and schizophrenia. In addition, Dr. Parrish has held positions at
various companies.
Wait, no, I want to say them correctly. Otsuka?
Yes, good.
Pharmaceuticals. Eisai, okay, and GE Healthcare. As the Director of Medical Affairs at GE Healthcare, she was a principal contributor in the development of the franchise in Alzheimer's disease imaging. Dr. Parrish started her career at Eisai Pharmaceuticals, Sorry about that. Where she was responsible for phase 4 clinical trial design in Alzheimer's disease and was the lead clinical scientist for the TAAAP study. Let me stop there. What does TAAAP stand for?
Treatment of African Americans with Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, thank you, good. And it says the first study of its kind in the treatment of African Americans with Alzheimer's. Okay. Dr. Parrish is the host and creator of Black Beaker Dialogues, a monthly YouTube interview series highlighting Black scientists and their journey to the PhD. And just so you know, yours truly was also a guest on her show.
Yeah.
And she is also the author of several articles on issues of science. Most recently, she authored the article entitled "The Legacy of Tuskegee Complicates African Americans' Feelings About Vaccines" on medium.com. So thank you to you both. And like I said, tonight's topic is healthcare disparities in the Black community. So let's get started. So I wanted to start out with COVID-19 because we are still in the middle of this global pandemic. There are so many issues just in general surrounding the pandemic in terms of conflicting scientific data, conflicting beliefs about the science. And then, you know, President Trump doesn't really help the situation because he seems to flip-flop on his position about how we should all be dealing with this disease. So it has led, it's kind of been, there's been this divide in the schools of thought as to should we mask, should we not mask, should we social distance, should we not social distance? Is there truly a thing where people can be asymptomatic, because now people are saying that's not a thing? So, but my main concern is with how the pandemic is affecting the Black community. And so I would like us to just talk about that. Like how, not just in terms of the healthcare, but also psychologically. Dr. Jen, your article was about, you know, how our fears are or feelings are really truly develop out of a legacy of healthcare disparities that have been ongoing.
Mistreatment. Yes. Yeah. I think the real issue that I've been struggling with probably for the past, I would say when the pandemic first became, let's say, widespread, and there was clearly an understanding that it was impacting communities of color, primarily African and Black people in this country.
Right.
And the question was, why? And what's interesting is if you look at other countries where there are Black and brown people, let's take the continent of Africa, there does not seem to be this same type of impact.
Right.
So we know it has nothing to do with the color of our skin. It has a lot more to do with how we are treated, and how the healthcare community sees us. You know, and I think it's multi-layered, right? Because there are a lot of Black people who work on the front lines not just in healthcare, not just as nurses and aides, etc., and doctors, yes, as well, but also in grocery stores and retail. And
Right.
so you cannot be exposed every day and not expect that, you know, these people will not be impacted.
Right.
But what I wrote about in the article was about the vaccine specifically, right? Because I think one of the things, and you talked about this, Linda, is, you know, there's conflicting data, there's conflicting information. And that happens in science because science is evolving. I mean, there are some things we know, like DNA is DNA.
Right.
And, you know, what the protein structure of any particular animal, you know, or molecule may be. But it's an evolving discipline, right? And you experiment and you learn new things, etc. And so with a novel virus like this, yeah, we're going to learn new things as we go. And so it should be expected that as we learn, we change, we modify. So I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with the conflict, because the conflict is really those who don't want to change based on what the data is uncovering, and those who are willing to change. And that's just going to happen. But, you know, the article was really specific to the issues of vaccination, clinical trials, and African Americans, particularly because there is a history and a legacy of mistreatment when it comes to healthcare of African American people in this country. And I think we have to talk about it. You can't just tell people run and go get into the clinical trial. We need Black people in the clinical trial. You have to really address the issues and address what has been done since then to protect people. And until you do that, people aren't going to enroll in clinical trials, and Black people aren't going to enroll in clinical trials, and may not take the vaccine. And that's how this all came up, because all my friends were saying, and family, Jen, I'm not taking the vaccine.
Well,
and
listen.
I was shocked.
Well, look, I didn't tell you this when I read your article, but I'm one of those people. A mutual friend of ours, she and I had a conversation, and she asked me if I would get it, and I told her I honestly do not know. If it's a requirement for, like, my daughter who is just entering college. I'm sorry, I need to put on my earbuds 1 sec. But if it's a requirement for my daughter who is entering college, absolutely, I will take her to the doctor so that here we go. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. I was hearing too much feedback, so I needed to put these in. So, you know, I will definitely take her to get it. Will I get it myself? I don't know. I don't even get a flu vaccine.
Why give something to your daughter that you wouldn't take yourself?
Because if it's a requirement for her to be able to go on campus to take classes, I would.
You're willing to take the risk, is what you're saying.
For her to get her degree, yes. But only because if it were not a requirement, I don't know that I would do it for her either. Honest. And I'm just being honest. Because I have issues with the history of not just disparities, but, you know, the history of the way that Black people have been tested and prodded and treated in this country when it comes to healthcare. We won't have to get into it now, but Henrietta Lacks is you know, a perfect example. So I don't know, you know, it might have to take, you know, it's going to take some soul searching. I'm sure I'll be calling you up and saying, hey, all right, what do I do? You know, so it's hard. It really is. So, but I know you get the flu vaccine. You stated that in your article. And I know, yeah, when this vaccine is developed. I know you'll be getting that as well. So do you
I don't
have,
know. I don't know if that's
okay, I was
so.
gonna say, do you have concerns?
Look, let's kick it over to Kirk.
Okay, Dr. Kirk. What about you? I mean, I want us to be honest. Do you have any concerns?
Well, for me, and you said a lot of different things that is complex, right?
Mm-hmm.
So personally, I don't have a concern with the vaccines overall. I am concerned about the rushing of the vaccines because of federal representatives and pressures to rush a vaccine,
Right.
which really compromises the level of compliance. Because you don't want to rush a vaccine and then end up killing more people because the vaccine has really bad side effects, right?
Right.
You want the vaccine to be efficacious. You want individuals that have pre-existing conditions like asthma, even multiple sclerosis. So AstraZeneca, for example, halted one of their clinical trials because an
Mm-hmm.
individual who did not know he or she had multiple sclerosis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a good thing because now they could really look at, okay, individuals that have pre-existing conditions, right? Autoimmune issues that would like to take it, they could take the vaccine safely.
Wait,
Um,
Kirk, can I ask you, so what do you mean
absolutely.
AstraZeneca had in their study, a person who didn't know they had multiple sclerosis? What?
That's what they said. So looking at, and my sources are CNN, CNBC, also NPR, as well as some other online articles, New York Times,
Mm-hmm.
Time Magazine, credible sources. They
Right.
said that they had to hope because the individual had multiple sclerosis, and it was kind of ambiguous. So there's either two things out of my assumptions, making an academic educated guess. Number
Mm-hmm.
one, the individual knew they had multiple sclerosis but did not disclose that
Mm-hmm.
prior to the trial. Or number
Or
two, multiple sclerosis, they did not know they had it because it was something that was developed.
Right.
They still didn't have the recurring symptoms of multiple sclerosis. But either way, again, that it's just ambiguous. But either way, they had to hope the trial. So that was a big a news story in regards to the vaccine.
Yeah.
What I will
Okay.
say quickly is that the issue regarding vaccines, particularly in not just the Black community, but Hispanic communities as well,
right.
Asian communities, is the history of course, human experimentation on communities of color. And that is not just solely an African American phenomenon, but it's
Mm.
all across all hues of
People of
communities of
color.
color.
Right.
And I
Yep.
think the mistrust is rooted in within racism. And of course, racism
Absolutely.
actually hasn't influenced medicine, but oddly enough, medicine has influenced racism through the dynamics of pseudo biology and eugenics,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
because eugenics was used in early, you look into 1800, 1900, early 1900s, even mid 1900s medical journals, you see justifications on treating communities of color and individuals of color a
Mm-hmm.
certain way because the thought literally was that they were a different race.
Right.
And of course, as people of color, especially as Black folks, through Tuskegee, through Henrietta Lacks, and through so many other different issues regarding human experimentation, it makes sense for you to say, I'm not going to get this vaccine because there is no level of trust.
Right.
And that is a huge disappointment, but that's going to continue until, number one, our country actually admits and not just only reconciles, but also has some type of restitution regarding racism. But the medical establishment also has to say, you know what, we really contributed because we created peer-reviewed articles and journals that were, of course, pseudo-science, pseudo-biology,
Right.
but it made it justifiable. It brought the justification to treat people of color that way because they thought it was scientifically necessary to do so. So these are, so many different layers in regards to where we're at right now.
Right.
And the last point I will make is regarding COVID-19, the reason why, or one of the reasons why African Americans, particularly since that was your question, is being impacted is because the great majority of the population doesn't have the luxury to be socially distant, right? A lot of Black folks are hands-on workers. They have to physically and presently be at work in order to get a paycheck.
Right.
So even social distancing and Zooming is a luxury that a lot of African Americans don't have because they're more blue collar type of workers rather than white collar type of workers that could use Zoom and other mediums. So these are just different historical and social dynamics that we really need to interplay regarding the qualitative elements of COVID-19. So these are just different things that my mind were revolving when Dr. Jennifer and you are talking about these issues of COVID-19 that are existing today.
And I want to add 2 points to that. One, and it's really going to play out now as children go back to school, because that's another factor that has to be considered, is because, a lot of children of color don't have the opportunity of being able to learn virtually because they may not have the laptops, or they may not have the the internet connection to be able to learn via Zoom, or they may be too young to even be at home because their parents have to go to work, because they don't have the ability to work at home. So they have to send their children to school. And if you're talking about people that have now lost their jobs, and so now families are joining together in one household even more so now than they did before. So now we have a child, maybe a 5-year-old, in kindergarten going to school, and, God forbid, they drop their mask, or they share their mask with their other little kindergarten friend, or who knows what they are being exposed to. And then they come home and could be exposing their entire family. So we have that complication to consider as well. But the other thing that the bigger issue that I want to, hi Bill, the bigger issue that I want to talk about is the differences in quote unquote race, because I want to not get into a whole conversation about what race is, but just make it clear to the audience that race is a social construct and it is not biological. And so when we talk about how these vaccines are acting in people of different races, or when we talk about like what you talked about in your book, Kirk, about race-based medicine.
Go get it.
What was that? Yes.
I said, go get the book, everybody.
Go get this book. He talks about race-based medicine. He talks about eugenics. He talks about how, well, I won't say anymore. I don't want to give it away. Buy the book. But what was my point? My point is that the differences that early pseudoscience called a difference in race as being biological is absolutely what's the word? It's false. We know it's false. It's a social construct. Right. But it's based on more geographic differences as opposed to biological differences, because we are all more alike biologically than we are different. So the geographic differences that we see result in phenotypic characteristics. So the texture of the hair, the darker skin, things like that. where it's not biological, it's not based in our DNA, it's based on phenotypic characteristics. So with that being said, Dr. Kirk, I just wanted you to give us a little bit of history, and then we're going to come back to talk about the COVID vaccine again. But just give us a little bit of history about what race-based medicine is, if you can.
Right. So before I go into the history, just to make it plain for those who don't understand the lingo, phenotypic means basically outside
Appearance,
or external characteristics, as I should say. Anthropologically speaking, all of humanity started in the continent we know now as Africa. And throughout the course of our human history, we migrated from Africa to different parts of the world. And as a result of that, over time, depending on where you are in the world, if you are farther away from the equator, where it's a lot cooler and you're closer to, for example, the North Pole or the South Pole, your skin, the melanin in your skin lightens, and that actually over time changed the color of your skin to be more lighter, and your hair texture and the physiognomy or the facial features change. If you stayed in Africa, that particular ancestral group stayed in Africa, they continue to have more melanin in their skin. Physiognomy really hasn't changed here. All texture hasn't changed, right? So the physical appearance is a precursor while we really think there's race, but it isn't. It's just part of our overall human history for thousands and thousands of years. And 99.9% of all of us are the same. It's that 0.01% that is an external trait that really makes it look like we're different, but we're really not.
Right.
With that being said, race-based medicine, right? What is that? Well, race-based medicine basically is a created niche market within the pharmaceutical industry that said we're going to actually tailor-make prescriptions and drugs based on somebody's race, right? Now, an example of that is Bidil. So in 2004, a drug named Bidil was made for heart failure issues. And they deemed that particular drug, quote unquote, the black race drug, end quote, right? And the last time I've checked, and just given the short little history, a drug should not or ought not to be based on race for two reasons. Number one, because internally we're 99.9% the same, right? And number two, it reasserts and reemphasizes the notion of race, that race is a biological reality. And it's not a biological reality.
Exactly.
But it reasserts this age-old thinking about we are separate people. And that continues with the treatment of Black people today, whether it's through the education system, whether it's through criminal justice reform, whether it's through police relations. We're always deemed as the other. And science and biology continues to reassert that when you have race-based medicine, right? And this is an example that I give to my students here. So if you have a headache, you're just going to take an aspirin, right? Advil, Tylenol, whatever. There's no aspirin solely for Black folks. This is the black aspirin here, and the white aspirin over here, and the red aspirin over here, and the yellow aspirin. No, aspirin is aspirin, right? But this is a false ideology that race-based medicine asserts, that biologically we're different and we need drugs tailor-made for different races because we're different, right?
Right.
And it's all done for economic gain, right? Which again is the love of money, right, is the root of all evil, and it reasserts the evils and the continued perpetuation and exploitation and oppression of people of color. So these are the different dynamics we have to look at. And I hand it over to Dr. Jennifer. I know she was itching to say something.
Yeah, all right, Dr. Kirk. You know I am, because I have spent my career in pharmaceuticals, and I have to say that, and I'm not aware of the drug that you were talking about that quoted itself as, or the company quoted it as some type of black drug. But any reputable pharmaceutical company does not look at race as a, or let's put it like this, they do not design drugs for particular races of people. That's just ridiculous. And
But it's been done.
no, I think, hold on. Can I have this conversation? Thank you. So I think what, and I'll tell you from my experience, right, that most studies are designed, you have clinical trials that are designed to look at a particular drug and how it works and whether or not it works, right? So that's the first question. Does this drug work? Who does it work for? Does it work for our particular population, that disease population? Meaning, if I want to see if a painkiller works, I may find people who have headaches, right? And then I'm going to test it in a phase 1 study, make sure it's safe in just regular people who don't have headaches, just, you know, just average people who are well, just to make sure it's safe. Then I'll study it in a phase 2 to see what dose to use. But the purpose of the studies are to see if your drug works, right? To see if it's efficacious. Now, what normally happens is once you get approval for that drug, and mind you, while those clinical studies are being conducted, you have a demographic, right? You collect demographic information. You have people who are enrolled in this study. What winds up happening is many times you don't have a lot of African American people or Black people who enroll in these studies or who are enrolled in these studies. And really the way to change that and the way to ensure that you have clinical trials that are more reflective of the population in these United States is to ensure that you, one, identify physicians who treat Black and brown people, and you promote and talk to Black and brown communities about your studies, etc., and the safety parameters that you've identified. And then the third is that you really have to find, I think, a way to alleviate a lot of concerns and issues that Black and brown people have about enrolling in clinical trials. But clinical trials are not designed to study races. They're designed to study diseases.
Okay, so with that being said, talk more about the news story that I just saw, I guess a few days ago, where they are really pushing to get the Black and Hispanic community to get involved in the clinical trials for the COVID-19 vaccine. But what I heard them say was because vaccines can act differently in people of different races.
Well, no, I don't know who would say that. That's just scientifically
exactly
not well informed scientifically. The truth is that the rationale for including Black and brown people in clinical studies, and in this clinical study in particular for COVID-19, is one, because it's a population that is been impacted. And the reason is, well, why? Maybe because they have greater exposure, right? So they're in these roles, etc. And Dr. Kirk talked about this. So they have greater exposure, right? So that means that if they have greater exposure, the likelihood is, let's study it or let's include these people in this study to make sure that if this drug, if we're saying it's efficacious, that it works for comorbid conditions. African Americans, for example, have higher rates of renal disease. African Americans have higher rates of diabetes.
Right.
African Americans have almost 60 times the rate of high blood pressure. That's significant. So either you include people in your study that meet those criteria, high rates of diabetes, renal disease, etc., or you include brown and Black people who you already know meet those criteria, right? So that's the purpose of trying to encourage Black and brown people to get into these clinical studies. And I'm not saying that they should or shouldn't, because I think, like I said, until you engage more African American physicians who treat these patients, until you start to talk to the community about the issues, and Dr. Kirk, mentioned this before, about the history of healthcare and the mistreatment of brown and black people in this country, and what the changes have, or the changes that have been implemented in order to ensure that all people are safe, then I wouldn't encourage anyone to go enroll in a clinical study if they don't, if those things aren't met. You have to start to address the systemic issues, right?
Yes.
Educate, but you have to address the systemic issues. And the truth is, you don't have a lot of African American physicians who are enrolling patients in clinical trials because they're not involved.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And to expound on what Dr. Jennifer said, a lot of the particular statistics that we have regarding different issues of whether epidemiological issues or pathological issues, historically has been based on white men. There's been no inclusion of people of color. There's been no inclusion of women. There's been no inclusion of white women, better yet, women of color, until the 1993 Act. So particularly the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, they had their Revitalization Act of 1993. And this was really an unprecedented particular act because it required federally funded clinical trials to include women and ethnic minorities and subjects to disaggregate statistics by gender and ethnicity. And later on in the early 2000s, they actually had an act to include children, right? And of course, they had a little bit more precautionary measures because children are the most vulnerable population, they're underage. But that was in 1993. And that wasn't that long ago, unfortunately. And you miss that with the mistrust of these communities of color. It continues to actually make it really hard for communities of color and individuals of color to be, participating in these particular clinical trials. And then you add the other layer of excluding doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals who are representative of these communities. And again, that speaks of another issue of course, medical education, how medical schools actually go about in their admissions process. That's a whole nother issue for another day. But these are the different dynamics that we really need to look into. The second is, of course, implicit bias, right?
Yes.
And I agree with Dr. Jennifer, right? Race should not be used in these particular cases, but they are. I actually came across on a bunch of particular articles, but one article was from the New York Times by Linda Villarosa, August 14th, 2019. So if you want to really look into that, you could Google Linda Villarosa, August 14th, 2019, New York Times magazine actually did this. And the article is entitled Myths About Physical Racial Difference Were Used to Justify Slavery and Are Still Believed by Doctors Today. So there are doctors, and there are also quantitative as well as qualitative studies about this, that believe there are genetic differences between races, that there are racial differences between races. There are researchers that believe so, ironically enough, because if you're a researcher, you know about, we as the genetic and human makeup, we're more similar than we are different. But for some reason, this is creeping and still infiltrating medical research. And the only reason is because, of course, personal and implicit biases, whether it's intentional or not intentional. And as a result of that, that mindset leaves really negative outcomes for communities of color, not just in the clinical setting, but also in pharmaceutical research as well. So this is where the qualitative elements of having implicit bias type of training or workshops, understanding about anti-racism, understanding about emotional intelligence, right, which is being aware of yourself, first of all, that you have these biases so you could correct it, but if you're not aware, you can't correct it and the problem continues to persist. But also empathic communication, putting yourself as a white doctor in the shoes of your Black patients. Now, of course, you'll never personally go through it, but at least you try to understand where they're coming from. At least it leaves a level of empathy and awareness that could be a positive result within your clinical practice. And of course, being aware of the community, which is a third element of emotional intelligence.
Right.
Understanding the community that you serve, right? Not just go home, after you work, but actually being immersed in the community and the people that live in the community you serve. These are very qualitative, important elements that can at least help alleviate the implicit bias and racism we see today. So
Right.
I just want different variables qualitatively. I think they're really important.
Yep.
Linda, can I
Absolutely.
just,
Go
okay.
ahead.
I just
Go ahead.
wanted to put a quick, I guess, response to that, because I think there was a lot there, right? And Dr. Kirk, I hear what you're saying. I don't know if I necessarily agree with everything that you're saying. And so let me just take it back for a minute, right? Because I think the issue of bias and implicit bias, yep, that's going to happen, right? Because people are people. And so I think that the issue is, does it creep into clinical practice? Most likely it does, right? If you go see a doctor and the doctor just assumes because you're a Black woman that you've had, your first child at, 15 or whatever, or, that you're, don't have diabetes and you're 50, what's wrong with you? So yeah, so those things happen, but in clinical studies, and I say this because I've been involved in developing clinical studies for a big part of my career. The whole purpose is that you are not necessarily designing a clinical study to look at any particular race, right? You are designing the clinical study to understand the disease. Now, if that disease happens to be higher in a particular race, and yeah, you are going to have some issues of race there. But the protocol is written, and I say this because we want to ensure that people start to understand, if I do want to get involved in a clinical study, what do I need to know? Well, there's a protocol that's written, and it says, these are the kinds of diseases that should be excluded from this study. And these are the criteria for people to be included in this study. And nowhere does it say in the inclusion criteria, Black people only, white people only, Asian people only. So I think we need to just kind of set that. And I don't know the particular article that you're referring to from Linda Villarosa, and I actually know her, she's a fellow scientist. But I would be surprised, because I think one of the things we have to do is we have to show the data. So okay, if that actual article shows the data, I'd be interested to see it and understand it, because there is no study that I know of that has been designed to focus on a particular race without, and let me say, I did a study that focused on African Americans and Alzheimer's disease. That was the criteria, right? To look at that population, because we wanted to understand how to treat and if there were any issues or differences, et cetera, in that population. One of the things, for example, in Alzheimer's disease is because African Americans with Alzheimer's disease tend to be, older, right, 70s, 80s, that population, many of them did not have access to go to college, did not have access to even finish high school, right? Many finished their schooling at 6th grade. And so what that means is, when you use some of these assessments to determine whether or not they have dementia, et cetera, the assessments have a floor, right? And so what happens is the assessments are not made for everyone, right? Because the assessment may be testing someone who has a 10th grade education or a college education. And if you've only been to 6th grade, you're gonna fail it just because you haven't had access to education, right? So I think we have to really start to pick it apart and look at when these types of studies are detrimental and impact patient health, and when we're actually trying to answer questions.
Right, absolutely. And just to clarify a couple things, the Villarosa article wasn't about clinical trials. It was about implicit biases and the beliefs of different healthcare professionals in regarding race. The BIDIL particular drug. A little quick history. It was first started in Nitromed, which was a smaller nutraceutical company. Now Arbor Pharmaceuticals actually is still selling Bidel for this heart failure drug. And it was actually a part of my particular research when I was a fellow at the American Heart and Stroke Association. Obviously, this is directed towards communities of color, and I was interested, and this was legitimately so, even, and that's why there's the red flags and alarms, the unethical practice. They did deem this drug, quote unquote, black drug. This drug was solely made for quote unquote black people, which opened a can of worms. So Dr. Dorothy Roberts talked about Bidel. Dr. Jonathan Kahn as well has a book called Race in a Bottle that talked about Bidel. So I'm not saying that the Bidel is definitely an anomaly, right? But hopefully it will be the only anomaly. We don't want other people to say, oh, let's look at and look at drugs in this particular way that they did with Bidel. I pray to God that does not happen. But for Bidel, it did happen. And we have to make sure that it stops at Bidel. So that was the whole point of that. So those are the two things.
I want to mention one other thing too, and Dr. Kirk, you touched on it, and that's regarding eugenics, because we there's an article that's out. I don't know exactly when it came out, about the North Carolina medical eugenics program. So these things are being uncovered, and we learn more and more about the history of what's been done to the African American community, where Black women were being sterilized, without their consent and without them even knowing what was being done to them. And so that adds to the concern, the fear, whatever you want to call it, of the African American community in terms of trusting the medical community, but also the way the medical community is tied into the government, like through the FDA, through the CDC, in terms of coming up with a COVID-19 vaccine that we can trust.
Right.
And not only that, I'll just throw in, my own fears, not fears. The reason I don't take the flu vaccine is because of the ingredient thimerosal and the whole, controversy that surrounded that. So there's, and that it doesn't even have anything to do with healthcare disparities in the African American community. These are just things that surround the whole issue of vaccines and healthcare in this country. And so yes.
Go ahead. Finish.
No, I was just going to say, so I wanted us to have this conversation to talk about all the things that we face as 3 African Americans sitting here who are unsure ourselves if we're going to take the COVID-19 vaccine, and so, like, what do we do?
Well, can I say first that I struggle with the word trust when it comes to most things, but especially healthcare. And I get it that there is a certain role that trust plays in engaging with any healthcare practitioner, or anyone who has your kind of life in their hands. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I get that. But I think we have to balance that word trust with information and being informed. And so I think that there is a need to ensure that when we go to the doctor's office, we aren't trusting them to tell us everything that we need to know. Instead, it's up to us also to be informed, to understand research. I mean, now we have the internet, we have, Google, everything. to research, to come prepared, and to ask questions. So as
But let me
go ahead.
just interject, because I completely agree with you. But we also have to remember, not everybody has a PhD in pathology. Not everybody has a master's in medical sciences. Not everybody has a PhD in medical humanities. So when we're talking about the most vulnerable of the African American community, the information may be there, but it doesn't mean they understand it. So sometimes all they have to fall back on is their trust.
Well, so I think that and I hear that, but I also think that we came from mothers and grandmothers and great grandmothers that, for example, my mother's grandmother had a child who had club feet. Everyone said there's nothing you can do about it. It's a done deal. This is just the way this child is going to be. And she researched, she talked to people, she asked questions, etc. I mean, granted, no one is going to be able to go to the internet and pull down, a full, medical record and be able to assess everything. But I do think that it's important for us to, if your grandmother or your mother is going to the doctor, or your father is going to the doctor, can I tag along? I need to talk to the doctor and ask some questions. Can I call in? We just have to be more informed when it comes to our own health care, because it's ours. It belongs to us. The doctor, the physician is merely an agent. We can change the agent, but we need to be informed. So when it comes to, for example, this vaccine, one of the things that I am telling my friends and family is just be informed. We already know clinical trials usually take years, and I don't mean 2 or 3. I mean 5 to 10.
Absolutely.
In order to demonstrate not just efficacy, but safety, because you have to be able to measure safety over time. You can take a drug today and it could have some type of systemic effect that you won't know about maybe for a year, right? Depending on the drug. So it's important to study safety over time. So one question is, well, how quick was this done? What safety measures were evaluated? And how long are the safety measures going to continue to be evaluated? Because be mindful, they're going to continue to study the safety even after they put this drug out on the market. They have to continue to study the safety. And so we should be asking those questions. We should be going and looking online to see what's available. Can everyone go to the CDC website? Probably not, easy to maneuver. NIH website, probably not. But I think there's a place where all of us can start. And if we can't start there, then we need to start pulling in some of our family members and those who can help us. We need advocates. The doctor is not going to be your advocate in all cases. And so if that's the case, we need to change the doctor, but we need to start asking the questions.
Right. And to respond to Dr. Jennifer, definitely I believe in patient empowerment. That is extremely important. But this is for me as a medical humanist where it's tricky. And this goes into the line of health literacy. Because information is out there, we know this now. A lot of people ask medical advice on social media, which you shouldn't do. But they do.
Yes, right.
And not every article that you Google is accurate, right? And not to say that you shouldn't go and do research. These are research skills that we're privy to because we have the education to understand this is actually not a real legit source.
Right.
But a lot of people don't. So I definitely agree with you regarding patients being empowered and being informed. It's just, I guess we as professionals will have to create a template for individuals, and what that template is, I don't know, but I'm just looking from a health education standpoint, because I came across this with American Heart Association. There are a lot of folks that couldn't read and write. They didn't know how to use a computer. So how do we reach out to those folks, right?
Exactly.
And again, that's a rhetorical question. So yes, patient empowerment and everything, but the nuances or the complexities in that is how do we
Right.
provide access
It's a
and
great
valid
point.
resources to them.
Yeah.
The other thing is, of course, with COVID-19, we're still trying to figure out COVID-19 because there's now
Right.
reports, as you know, as a pathologist, that people that were asymptomatic, meaning they didn't have any symptoms, months later, now they have heart issues and they have to go to cardiologists to check. So this
Yeah.
this virus is a beast. It's something
It's
else.
a
Yes.
beast. Yeah.
You know, you could get it and then 14 days later, you know, you feel sick. But the 14 days prior, you're fine. So they're
Yeah.
still
Right.
trying to figure out the virus rather than the
The
vaccine. So
vaccine.
we need
Exactly.
to
Exactly.
have, you know, and I agree with you, as you said, we need to really just be patient. And I know a lot of people in America, we're very spoiled. We love our freedom. We like to go about, and it really has compromised a lot of people's way of life.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I'd rather wait 3 years and make sure I'm good than to do something stupid and be dead in a year,
Absolutely.
right? So again, it comes with being our American psyche of liberty. You know, I'm not going to wear a mask because it's against my freedom, right? And that particular mentality
Right.
that we have to try to conquer, because it's not really about you, but it's about being patriotic and not thinking about you because you're not sick, but what about that elderly person over there? What about that little kid? What about that lady over there that has asthma, right? So
Right.
it's about being more humanistic in our thinking. So those are just the different things that came across my mind as I'm hearing your response about patient advocacy, which is very important,
Yeah.
health literacy and education, which is very important.
Yeah.
But as everything, there's always some complexities in that we have to try to iron out the
But
best way
Dr.
we
Kirk,
can.
I think you raised an excellent point, and I probably, and I know, Linda, we have a certain format that you want to follow, but I probably would stop there and dig deeper there, because I think that's really where our liberation comes from regarding the health system, is understanding how do we engage people who may not have access? How do we engage people who you know, may not be able to get the information? How do we engage them? How do we advocate for them? Because that is, you know, I think we are going to be responsible, and then we can hold others accountable for you know, their treatment of us. But we,
Right.
I think, need to be responsible for each other as a community to say, how do we start to engage people who may not be able to access that information? How do we start to help them and advocate for them? And I think that's really the work that needs to be done. I'm not sure that I can control everything, but I know that that's one space that, you know, we can control and own, and then we can start to influence and put pressure on the other side of the system to say, now you'll treat us accordingly.
Right.
And Dr. Jen, as a response before LWC chimes in, this is where not only being a bioethicist and a medical humanist, but a clergy comes into play, because I had the pleasure of going and speaking with different medical schools. Most recent, I was on a panel with Seton Hall Medical School. Well, it's Hackensack Meridian Medical School at Seton Hall University. That's their long title. And they asked me, well, what can we do? Well, medical schools, doctors, and also like American Heart Association, American Cancer Society, lymphoma, lupus. I mean, all these associations should have non-traditional partners, like the church or the temple or the mosque or the synagogue, religious institutions that really focus on spirituality, but you really can't be fully whole if you're physically and mentally ill, right? So this is where holism or holistic connections comes into play. So creating health ministries, for example, where we have partnerships that for Sunday, the pastor could preach about a healing narrative that Jesus healed somebody, and that could be interplay regarding mental health or overall health or something of that particular nature. And then half of the sermon, instead of the pastor preaching the other half, we have a medical doctor or a pathologist like yourself or epidemiologist or somebody come in to educate the particular congregants about something, and they have pamphlets. I know working with American Heart Association, I know that regarding health literacy, pamphlets should not be anything over a 7th or 8th grade reading level. I did not know until all those logistical things I found out about. So people who are illiterate, but they could understand, middle school or high school, language, that they could at least have some type of understanding. So that's just one solution that just popped in my head, that it's like, wait, I did, or we did this, I won't say me, but AHA really just picked each other's brains to say, how can we actually help communities? So I think the Black church, in particularly, but churches and religious settings in general, that's an untapped resource that we could really help people to be empowered and educated. So I just wanted to respond to that. I think that could be at least one avenue that we could use to really help individuals in communities of color.
And I just want to jump in there, because I'm going to give the two of you a charge and say, we need to talk offline about doing some of these things that just came up in this conversation. And I'm very serious, because I'm sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, we need to have a part 2 to this conversation, but maybe not a part 2 to this conversation. Maybe we need to put our heads together and see what we can do to do exactly some of the things that you both just mentioned, because there are so many people that are suffering needlessly. And we all have the expertise to be able to do something. There are others that can do something. Dr. Kirk, you and I are part of Liberative Justice Ministries, and this is part
LJM.
of what, yes, this is part of what we want to do. So we need to talk offline about this.
Let's do that. And Linda, I just want to add, because I didn't give the end of the story, but my great grandmother did find a physician in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Oh, okay.
Did the surgery on her son and resolved the club foot, and was able to set it, and he walked normally for the rest of his life. So
awesome.
I just wanted to say, because I'm sure people were like, okay, well, what happened?
Right.
Research, but so what? She did the research, and what she didn't know, she asked, and she was able to find resources to get her into Knoxville and get her what she needed. So I just want to say that we are a strong community. We are strong people. There is a lot we can do for each other, to help each other, and to advocate for each other. And then we start to tell the systems, this is how we want to be treated. Or not then, in addition to, we tell the systems, this is how we want to be treated. This is what we expect from you. You are our agents. And therefore, right, this is what we want. So I think we can do both.
Absolutely. I agree.
Amen.
Amen. And on that note, because it's been almost an hour, so I don't want to, prolong the show.
We could talk even more about this, but I know we want people to be there for 5 hours.
I know. So look, maybe we need to have a conference. We'll talk about that. So any final words, or did you pretty much wrap up everything that you wanted to say?
Go ahead, Dr. Jennifer. You can go first.
You go, Dr. Kirk, because I think I'm all talked out. I don't know what else to say.
Okay. I always have stuff to say. That's what my students criticize me, because I always have something to say. But no, this was a very important talk. And for those that are listening, I would suggest, as Dr. Jennifer mentioned, to be empowered, right? Always get a second opinion, always responsibly try to find information. So if you're going to get information, make sure it's from a legitimate source. Don't ask information on social media outlets like I see all the time.
Just list some sources, Kirk, real quick.
Some sources,
Yes.
So Healthline.com is great. WebMD is good. Harvard Medical School, they have some good things. The Mayo Clinic also has great things as well. Columbia University, New York University. So, yeah, you could use those as a start.
Right.
There you go.
And the other thing I will say to Dr. Kirk's point is, as you are getting information, and I agree, don't go to Facebook to get your, just don't.
Yeah, you know.
Just don't do it. Just don't. I don't even want to have it.
We'll leave it there. We'll leave it at that.
We'll leave it there. Just don't do it. But, and I know that many are becoming suspicious of the government agencies like the CDC and the NIH, etc. But actually, there is one site that has, it's FDA.gov, that has all of the clinical studies listed on their site, and you can go in and you can look at the particular drug that's being tested or vaccine that's being tested. You can look at some of the criteria, and it doesn't have the data on you know, whether or not the vaccine is effective, but it will at least give you information so you will understand, for example, how the vaccine is made, right? So, you know, does it have any agents that you may be allergic to, or whatever it is.
Right.
So that may be a place to start. All clinical studies have to be reported on this website. It's, I think it's clinicaltrials.gov, right? You can get to it through the FDA website, or you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, and it will give you a list. Actually, I think it has a little tab that says COVID-19 vaccines. You can pull up all of the vaccine trials.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for being my guests tonight. I truly appreciate it. This was a wonderful conversation. Even if I still want you to be open to having a part 2, because maybe, you know, 6 months from now, once the vaccine is developed, maybe we really need to have a part 2 to this conversation. So let's keep our, you know, let's stay open to a part 2 for that reason. But also, like I said, let's talk offline about what we can do to begin to address some of the issues that we brought up. Because it's one thing to, you know, identify the issue, but it's a completely different thing to be able to start addressing some of these issues. So thank you both so much. I truly appreciate it. This was a wonderful conversation. Wonderful.
Thank you.
So I guess that's it. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. You two hold on.